Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a story of absolute extremes. We're looking at James A. Garfield, the unlikely rise and preventable ruin. Let's just jump right in. Garfield's life is basically the ultimate paradox. It's a completely dramatic story that takes us from absolute nothingness to the highest office in the land. He was the literal embodiment of the American dream. He was the last president born in a dirt floor log cabin, who somehow transformed himself into this brilliant, multilingual mathematical prodigy. But here's the wild part. His end? It wasn't actually dictated by an assassin's bullet, but by the unwashed hands and sheer medical hubris of his own doctors. So to understand how a man capable of such a remarkable rise met such a cruel, completely preventable end, we really have to start at the very beginning. And that beginning was forged in what we could call a true frontier crucible. Born back in 1831 in this wild, untamed patch of Ohio wilderness, young James entered a world where brutal poverty wasn't just common, it was the daily baseline of existence. Just think about the harsh reality here. When James was only 18 months old, his father died from a sudden fever after fighting a forest fire. That left his mother, Eliza, entirely alone on an isolated 80-acre plot of land. But wow, Eliza was a rock. She instilled in him this fierce drive for respect, a deep sense of morality, and the firm belief that education was his one and only ladder out of the mud.
Now get this number, 16. That is the shocking number of times a teenage, scrawny Garfield, who, by the way, couldn't swim a single stroke, fell overboard into the dark waters of the Ohio Erie Canal. Desperate to escape the drudgery of the farm, he'd taken this grueling job driving mules along the waterway. It was incredibly treacherous work. In a span of just 6 weeks, he took those 16 terrifying plunges, and literally every single one was a brush with death, just gasping for air and clinging to passing branches to survive.
Well, those near-death experiences changed absolutely everything. After one particularly terrifying dunking, he actually contracted a severe bout of malaria. Completely delirious and defeated, he dragged himself home to his mother, and he promised to turn to books instead of the water. As he later reflected, being tossed overboard and compelled to sink or swim was the exact catalyst he needed. His failures on the canal drove him right off the water into an intense, ferocious pursuit of education. He just began to absolutely devour languages, debate, and mathematics.
And his intellectual pursuits went to staggering extremes. Garfield wasn't just a smart student, he became a multifaceted prodigy. Get this, as a parlor trick that would absolutely dazzle his college classmates, Garfield could sit at a table and write ancient Greek with his right hand while simultaneously writing Latin with his left hand. No way, right? It is just an amazing leap from a ragged, bullied farm boy to this highly sophisticated, brilliant scholar.
So, how does a scholar transition into a soldier? Well, when the American Civil War erupted, Garfield, who was by then a staunch abolitionist and an ordained preacher, viewed the conflict as an absolute moral crusade. He actually recruited his own students to form a regiment and rapidly rose to the rank of Major General. He showcased sheer strategic brilliance at the Battle of Middle Creek, totally outmaneuvering Confederate forces. Later on, he performed the daring, life-saving Ride of Garfield at Chickamauga, literally galloping through miles of heavy enemy fire just to rally crumbling Union troops. It's endlessly fascinating how his mind handled this extreme trauma. Amidst the horrific, unimaginable carnage of 19th century warfare, we're talking disease, mud, unprecedented bloodshed, Garfield found intellectual escapism. Picture this. In 1862, in the quiet, tense lulls between active combat, he would just sit down and sketch out an original mathematical proof of the Pythagorean theorem using a trapezoid. He actively sought order in the absolute chaos of war, and that theorem was actually later published in a prominent education journal. But while that mathematical proof showed a calm, ordered mind, privately, he was deeply, deeply vulnerable. He wrote this devastating line to his wife, laying bare the hidden mental toll the war actually took on him. He wrote, "The horrors of the battlefield are beyond description. The groans of the wounded and dying haunt my sleep." So beneath that stoic commander exterior we always picture, he carried the immense guilt of watching the very students he recruited fall in battle. Following his military service, Garfield transitioned into the political arena. He ended up navigating 18 highly complex years in Congress during the Gilded Age. Now, this was an era defined by deep national fractures following Reconstruction and rampant systemic corruption in Washington. The notorious spoils system was in full swing, which basically meant that government jobs were handed out as political favors for loyalty rather than actually being earned by merit. Garfield found himself right in the middle of these intense congressional battles, trying to balance his radical ideals for civil rights with the pragmatic and, honestly, often dirty compromises required to keep a broken nation functioning.
We really have to view Garfield objectively here. He was a deeply complex, flawed human being. Beneath the surface of the devout preacher, the devoted family man to his wife Lucretia, and the tireless champion for the 14th and 15th Amendments, there were deep shadows. He was entangled in the massive Credit Mobilier Railroad financial scandal and accused of accepting stock dividends in exchange for legislative favors. And privately, he also engaged in an extramarital affair with an 18-year-old reporter, a betrayal that nearly destroyed his marriage. So he was certainly not a flawless hero by any stretch.
Even despite those controversies, his towering intellect and leadership really made him a central figure in his party. Now, let's look at the 1880 Republican Convention. The party was completely fractured. It took a chaotic, exhausting 36 ballots to finally break a deadlock. 36! The exhausted delegates basically threw up their hands and dragged Garfield into the spotlight as the ultimate dark horse nominee. And the crazy part? It was an honor he actually stood up and tried to loudly reject right there on the convention floor. You see, he didn't view the presidency as some glittering prize. He saw it as a heavy, inescapable burden of duty. Right before taking office, he penned this haunting, fatalistic diary entry. "I enter this office with dread for power, is a heavy crown, and I fear it may crush those I love." He truly felt the crushing weight of a fractured nation resting squarely on his shoulders.
Once in office, during his remarkably brief 200 days as president, Garfield hit the ground running as a progressive reformer. He directly challenged his own party's powerful bosses by fighting tooth and nail to dismantle that corrupt spoils system in favor of a merit-based civil service. He launched investigations into massive postal fraud. And fascinatingly, during his campaign, he even taught himself German so he could address immigrant voters bilingually in English and German, which was a presidential first. He was actively, passionately laying the groundwork for improved education and African-American civil rights. But tragically, all of this progress was abruptly shattered on July 2nd, 1881. Charles Guiteau, a deranged, disgruntled office seeker who delusionally believed God had commanded him to remove the president, shot Garfield in the back at a Washington train station. As he was being subdued, Guiteau shouted that he was a stalwart, which was a radical faction of Garfield's own party. He delusionally believed he was paving the way for a major political shift by putting Vice President Chester A. Arthur in power. Now, here is the true tragedy of the story. The bullet didn't actually hit any vital organs. It was highly survivable. But Dr. Willard Bliss took over the president's care, initiating what can only be described as a catastrophic display of medical hubris. Bliss completely ignored emerging antisepsis science. He and several other doctors repeatedly probed Garfield's open wound with unwashed fingers and entirely unsterilized instruments. They even brought in Alexander Graham Bell's brand new metal detector to try and find the bullet, but they missed it completely. Why? Because they literally forgot about the metal springs hidden in Garfield's mattress. Ultimately, it was their interventions that induced a massive, fatal infection. The cruel irony of all this unfolded over agonizing months. He was shot in July, and the botched medical interventions dragged out all through August, including that failed metal detector incident. Finally, in September 1881, Garfield succumbed to sepsis and a massive heart attack. The subsequent autopsy confirmed something absolutely heartbreaking. The bullet was actually harmlessly encapsulated in tissue. It was the medical mismanagement that directly killed the president. For 79 excruciating days, Garfield endured this medical agony, and yet his incredible fortitude never broke. While losing 80 pounds and suffering unimaginable pain from daily unsterilized probing, he still maintained his spirit. He joked with his doctors about his wounded spine becoming a canal, he requested simple comforts like a slice of strawberry pie, and he had newspapers read to him every single day. His grace under that 79-day torture was just nothing short of remarkable. So, what does this all mean for us today? Garfield's death was a tragic what-if for American progress, but his legacy firmly remains. The massive public outrage over his assassination directly sparked the Pendleton Act of 1883, which finally brought meritocracy and civil service reform to the federal government. His early groundwork for civil rights laid vital foundations for future equity policies. And, grimly enough, his highly publicized, completely preventable death served as a massive wake-up call. It rapidly accelerated the global adoption of medical antisepsis, which has saved countless lives worldwide ever since.
James A. Garfield was a true paradox. He was a genius and a canal boy, a moral preacher and an unfaithful husband, an ambitious politician who absolutely dreaded power. It leaves us with a really provocative thought to consider. Does true greatness in leadership require flawless morality, or are deeply flawed, complex humans like Garfield the only ones truly capable of navigating the mud to drive meaningful change? Think on that for a bit, and we'll see you in the next explainer.